or why is it that we have such it's such a challenge to address this, and what are some of the things that are happening right now in the state of California when it comes to kind of addressing some of these big looming issues. But just again, an important grounding for us here in California and the history of land. And ultimately, since European American colonization, the history of land has been one of theft and displacement and discrimination towards Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Systemic racism continues to hinder food producers from gaining tenure and ownership to farmland for food production, and in a massive way. And there's a number of reasons why, both from what I've named, but also inherited wealth disparities, historically unjust lending practices, discrimination from the USDA and other state agencies, and ultimately limited access to support services. This centuries of systemic racism, paired with today's kind of corporate and private investment land grabs that we're seeing, access to land is becoming more and more impossible. California, I'm sure many of you that are farmers across the state, you've seen that California agricultural land has been consolidating pretty rapidly, and including involvements of hedge funds and investment groups. And many of these operations they focus on returns on investment, not community investment. So they're fundamentally extractive in their models, and they prioritize exports rather than, again, investing in community. And we have some of these statistics today of like 50% of cropland is owned by the top 5% of landowners in the state of California, and 37% of land is owned by non-farmers. So when we think about land that is rented or leased, that's primarily by non-farmers and people likely outside of the state of California. So our fundamentals of agriculture are not owned by our communities anymore, but rather large corporations and non-farmers. So I name all of this to say, like, these problems are really complex. We have systemic racism, we have corporate land grabs, we have rapid consolidation issues. And so when we have these massive problems that took hundreds of years to create, our policy solutions also need to be complex. So it can't just be one issue, it needs to be many. And they also need to touch on other issues related to land, right? Water is very much connected to land when we think about access or equitable access to land. So when thinking about solutions, they need to be transformative. There needs to be many. And they fundamentally need to include and center the voices of those that have been most marginalized. Which is what led us, and many of these panelists are part of a collective that we've formed in the last year to advocate for what's called the Land Equity Task, or the Agricultural Land Equity Task Force. This vision creates a body that centers underserved farmers or community members, and is currently, being formed, and the intent is for it to be run by the state of California. So they can be there with us in that conversation and have some skin in the game, and be invested in this systemic issue and come up with policy solutions together. So that is one of the advocacy tools that we're going to talk about, or something that's currently being formed right now. So an actual systemic shift that we're trying to create with policy. But we want to leave space for other policy solutions or other ideas that come up in this conversation. So I am going to kind of facilitate this incredible panel that we have. And maybe hopefully, Beth, you can help me like pin some of our speakers so everybody could see them in the sea of land advocates that we have here. So we've got Adam, and then we've got Cheyenne, and don't worry, we'll have formal introductions. And we've got Cheyenne out there, and then Carlos, where are you? And then when I can find Carlos, here we go. I'm gonna just pin Carlos here so we can all kind of be centered here on this Zoom screen. So we're going to spend some time with our panelists here. I am going to let them introduce themselves with this first question because I think they would do a much better job than I could. And the many things that they are all kind of have their fingers in terms of advocacy and engagement in their communities. So so in this first question, which is going to be directed to Carlos, Carlos, introduce yourself and your work and where you are in California. But the question is, how do you experience land tenure barriers?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I'm sorry I'm not able to turn my camera on right now. I'm doing this remote, but I'll be happy to join in just by voice. My name is Carlos, and I work for Central California Environmental Justice Network, which is an organization in conjunction and in tandem with the greater work of agroecology that one of the many works that's happening here is through Matriarchal Council, which is composed of Indigenous women of color from the Central Valley who are guiding our work in agriculture. And we're a partnership with a couple of folks in Tulare and then a couple of other folks from different areas in the area here in the Central Valley, Wichamni, which is the Yokuts, and then a Food Link from Tulare County, which is Food Bank, and us in Central California Environmental Justice Network in Fresno. And the work that we do is through agroecology, and the teachings of the things that we're looking at is developing a pilot farm work program where land could be accessed and be practiced to permaculture principles, and actually have community members have collective ownership at land to be able to work in tandem with the land here. That work is happening, as I mentioned, here in the greater Central Valley, California. The ways, I think, for us here that we've encountered a lot of the barriers to the access to land is the access to land itself. Working in the greater Fresno area, surrounded by miles and miles and miles of fields, for us to access something with infrastructure is very difficult. There's always an issue with land. It's either land in the wells are dry, or there's land in, there's no infrastructure, there's no power, there's no wells, the pumps are broken, there's toxicity. So the land, the air, the water is toxified. So for us, having access to clean land that has infrastructure has been an amazing barrier. One of the ways that we're trying to solve that is to create a partnership with folks in the community. For example, we're creating a partnership with a church in Fresno, Seventh-day Adventist Church in Fresno, and we're piloting a program through the land use that we have created an agreement with them. So the way that we resolve the issue at this point is to create a 7-year partnership with folks to be able to use that land, which has the infrastructure, has the means to have water, the means to have power, and create that, but it's still a short-term solution to a greater problem, as you mentioned, that it's highly complex. So in addition to that, the other barrier is just, sorry to any folks that work with the city or county, but the bureaucracy and the paperwork of having access to any type of land that is justifiably and reasonably, absolutely reasonably done in a way that paperwork doesn't stop the speed at which you need to move to create your goals. It's just amazingly ridiculous. It's been an uphill battle for us to do that. So just the process itself is part of greater barrier that we're experiencing on our end. I know there's different parts from other different folks, but on our end, that's what we're experiencing at this point.
Thanks, Carlos. This next question is for you, Adam. How do you experience land tenure barriers from an urban ag perspective? And please introduce yourself as
Will
well.
do. Yeah, so I'm Adam X. I am a advocate, partner in arms with a lot of people on this call in regard to land access. That's the reason why I'm here. So work a lot with Jamie, Beth, Carlos, Nelson's on the call as well. Nelson Hawkins, Timu's on this call in regard to land access for underserved people of color. My current employment right now is I am the director of finance for Crop Swap LA. So we grow food in the hood. We grow food on unused spaces, primarily front lawns, and distribute produce to the neighbors. We also have a venture where we have our staff pick fruit in people's lawns that they aren't using and distribute to the neighbors. So we are our lane is specifically urban ag and water recycling. But like I said, I'm here really speaking on behalf of the collective we have formed that ultimately led to the Land Equity Task Force that is passed into law and is being formed as we speak. Yeah. And in regard to the question, is land barriers for urban perspective? It's and I just put it in categories of where I see is when you got big cities, you have a lot more bureaucracy on a minute level. So zoning restrictions, there's legally things that you can and cannot do on parcels of land, and you're going to bump up into barriers, and they could just be antiquated laws that are just on the books and no one has changed them. And that just requires time and energy and advocacy and lobbying efforts to get those changed when you could be growing food. So that's a primary barrier. And then also, I'll speak specifically in Los Angeles, where I'm based out of, is absurd land prices to where buying land for growing food is literally not economically feasible, which is why developers and corporate interests have the leg up in regard to land grabs, because they have the capital and they actually have the projects that can yield the revenue to justify the purchase. So it's a function of economics, is to where you quote unquote urban farmers, when it comes to accessing land, you can get grandfathered into it by people who own land, or you can go on the open market and attempt to buy land to grow food and also have to compete against corporate ag interests. So it's just it's an uphill battle economically within that vein. And then another restriction, just then, I deal a lot specifically in Los Angeles, primarily the Black community. Then I would say after that, Latino community. And the beautiful thing about our collective is that I'm getting now exposure to the Indigenous and Native communities and their specific issues, which I haven't in my career had intimate knowledge, familiarity with. So it's always a pleasure to learn and be able to align with that. But as far as, my universe is in the urban environments, everyone's either on survival mode or in rat race mode. So really my team, specifically Tumu and Nelson, is just, in order for us to do real land work, we have to really change the culture around to have a focus more on agriculture. So if land access, or even the thought of the need for land to actually do what you want to do, isn't on your mind, you're not going to care about all the cool, fancy policy stuff that your people are doing in Sacramento. So those are the barriers: zoning restrictions, commercial viability, competition with developers, and then culture. That's it.
I feel like for anyone that joined the session earlier today, they got an intimate perspective on the barriers of the UAIZ program and how it just doesn't work for urban farmers or really anyone. As Janet from LA Food Policy Council was able to present on it, and it was really wonderful. So just really diving into those barriers in a real way. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that, Adam. And yeah, to shift now to Cheyenne. Thank you. Yeah, Urban Ag Incentive Zone Program. You, Cheyenne, you grow on a reservation. You kind of have land to access to land in a technical sense. If we were just, but how do you experience land tenure or security issues as it relates to food security and water in particular? I know it's especially big problem.
Hey, thanks, Jamie. So Manahu, Inani and Cheyenne Stone, Panatu Nu Agimana, Nu Nobidu Togo Wanamatu, Nu Togo Naniet, Carl, Nu Ma'a Naniet, Francisca Fimbers, Nu Hitsi Naniet, Evelina Stone, Nukununiet Raymond Stone, Nubia Nuniet Rosella Stone, Nu Nuniet Ross Stone. My name is Cheyenne Stone. I'm a member of the Big Pine Paiute tribe. I'm also the co-chair for CAF. Usually in our Indigenous communities, we kind of always try to figure out who we're related to. And so a big thing is always trying to introduce ourselves, who our parents are and grandparents are, because in some way or another, we're all related. Somehow you'd be surprised how many relations I have throughout California and Nevada and so forth. So there was my introduction, but great question, Jamie. And so I think a lot of my peers on the panel today kind of spoke to very relevant issues in regards to land access. I have a bit of a different experience. And my different experience is I have land currently, not a lot of land. I would say if I wanted to, I'd have 2 acres, but I myself personally have an acre of land on the Big Pine Paiute Reservation. And so part of the whole sort of self-determination and self-sufficiency and policy of the federal government when they started to assimilate a lot of the Indigenous people in California was that they did justification for moving a lot of the Indigenous people to concentrated land throughout California. And so I live in a very rural area, whereas if you ever have a chance to come on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains from Inyo County, my ancestors have been here, from time immemorial. Our petroglyphs, a lot of cultural artifacts, they're very still prevalent in this area. A lot of our gathering spaces are still in this area. However, access to water has always been an issue since the early 1900s when William Mulholland started extracting a lot of the water resources down to Los Angeles. And so knowing I have some fellow people and farmers and land stewards from Los Angeles, it's always good to know because it's a give and take relationship. And when I say it's a give and take relationship, we have to be very cognizant of where our resources are extracted from because it comes at a price of another. And usually the price of another is the BIPOC communities that have been the consequences of some of these policies and decisions because of land extraction or water extraction and for justifiable reasons and so forth. And so a very interesting concept is access to land is I might have an acre or 2 acres and 3 if I want to include my parents' house of growable land, but access to land is also kind of one of those barriers. And a good example is even though I have an acre of land, I'm not able to extract resources or receive equity on that land because it is held in federal trust. So when someone says, well, let me go ahead and take out some equity on the land you have or to build a house, I have no equity. I am working with nothing. And so someone goes, well, what's your down payment? And I'm like, I got $15,000 in the bank. What else do you need? But my land, I cannot get appraised, which would be in Inyo County, well over $100,000 in order to draw off equity. So my access to land is a bit different as far as being able to derive equity from any of my farming operations. I also have on reservation land policy that limits my ability to sell my land as well as holding land in trust. I'm not able to do certain things without the approval from the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the tribal government. So as I tell people, at the whim of a pen, there really could be consequences and it's not sustainable depending on the political environment that we may face in the future. At the whim of a pen, tribal governments can be gone. Regardless of the treaties and water rights that some tribes may or may not have. And so I think Jamie, as well as my fellow peers, I always like when people do the land acknowledgement because you're acknowledging that there was a people here prior to that. And sometimes looking at the face of genocide, displacement, and ongoing systematic racism, we really have to dissect some of these systems. However, in our Indigenous communities, land is a new concept for people that didn't get necessarily removed to urban areas because growing up, we would gather where the resources were, regardless of it being private property, federal government property, or state property. It was kind of like, well, the willows are over there, the pine nuts are over there on federal land. Like, I'm not going to ask somebody's permission. I'm just going to go harvest, because traditionally that's what we've always done. But like anybody, it comes at the price of access requires policy decisions and cognizant ability to say, hey, how come this isn't accessible? How come our BIPOC communities don't have access to the necessary revenue to generate some of these income to make a profit? And a good example is land accessibility also requires you to look at, traditionally, most Native American tribes won't consider land as land or farming or agriculture as a business. It's more of like a survival mechanism in our relationship with the Mother Nature and the earth, and how we utilize the resources and so forth. So with that said, I guess those are some of my barriers as far as being able to derive equity from the land that is held in trust by the federal government.
Thanks so much, Cheyenne. And yeah, every time I talk to you, I learn something new, and it's tremendously helpful and valuable. And I'm sure I speak for many on this session that have learned a lot just from these opening questions from all three of you. And so kind of this next question dives a little bit more into like, why do you choose to engage in policy work other than like me convincing you? Like what, why have you committed, particularly like the past year, really a lot, to working on policy solutions, to like working on things that are sometimes really challenging to commit to, right? This idea of a task force, we're committing to a policy idea that will take many years to really see, like a very long time to see the fruits of, potentially. And so, yeah, the question is really vague in the sense of like, why do you engage in policy work, and what do you hope will actually come from it? And feel free to, answer in any scale that you want, whether it's next year or the next 10 years. Yeah, maybe I'll hand this to Carlos first.
Thank you, Jamie. I think for us, the thing that we're looking at through policy here, like most folks, is there's systemic issue. We all know about that. We all know it looks very different at every location. So it adds another layer of complexity, right? So for us being either semi-rural, fully rural, we encounter a whole different set of issues than, let's say, what Adam would encounter in urban, or what Cheyenne would encounter in her region, right? So for us specifically, the thing that we look at when we look at policy is the equitability of policy, but how does that look like on an everyday level, right? So we can look at the policy and the greater changes, but folks next door to me still are going to be affected, or they're not going to be affected at all by the policy. And that's really where the crux of it all begins to fall apart. This is, are we creating policy that is created by unadvised or disconnected perceptions that have no idea how that translates to everyday accessibility, right? So for example, if we look at zoning, so Adam was mentioning zoning earlier. So if you look at zoning, for example, here in Fresno, R5 is single family zoning. So part of the issue that doesn't allow us to continue to produce more farms where we can is because there's R1 zone or R5 zoning.
Oh no.
Carlos, you dropped.
We lost
man.
Carlos.
Carlos.
The reality of weather and living in the Central Valley, folks.
Yeah.
I'm here.
There he is. There he is.
Came back. Sorry, y'all. If you knew where I'm at right now, I'm in the middle of somewhere where like one bar of reception, and that's, you're right, that's the reality that we have. That's part of it, right? It feels like that's the analogy that we have. It's the reception of policy doesn't reach us all at our individual levels when we need it to, so it's like the teenager's paradox. It says you need, as a teenager, you need money to get a car to get a job, and a job to get money. So when you transfer that over to the land issue, it's the same as you need land to get equity, equity to get money, money to get land. So how do you get out of that paradox? So for us, looking at policy has to address all those three things in tandem, you know, and when you break that down even further to how are folks being affected, which folks, who specifically, what region, and at what capacity. So for example, the folks that we work with here, farm worker community, they're what I say is they're stuck in limbo in a system that we have that underappreciates, underrepresents, underpays, and underemphasizes the inequity that they experience. They're stuck in limbo. They can't climb up the ladder to purchase, buy, lease land because of the wages that they're being paid are just do not allow that. And then they can step aside from that system to create their own equity. So they're stuck either way. So either way they look at it, there's no way for them to advance. So for us, policy, how can policy that has to do with land tenureship and equity access address those specific barriers that we have? And then when we look at, okay, yes, we can get land. Is it equitable? Is it an equitable access? Is it land that has power structure? Is it land that has drainage structure? Is it land that has water already infrastructured into it? Is it non-toxic? Again, I go back to that. So we may have access to land, but the access that we have to that land is usually poor access, is access that is toxified, or it's a Superfund site where people are like, you can plant there. They don't tell you that it's toxified. So then you end up with a whole barrage of issues. So policy, to go a long way about to say policy for me has to address the everyday concept of the barriers that we see every day, right? And you have to almost get hit in the face with those barriers to really understand them, because we see them and we've been seeing them for so long, they're becoming a blur in front of our everyday lives. And that's the point of policy that I would really love to see as a change, is to emphasize the issues that we see every day that we're no longer thinking about, or at least not discussing with folks at the state level, federal level, to address them. So for us, that's where it's at.
Any Adam, Cheyenne, anything to add to that? Thank you, Carlos.
For real. Yeah, that was good.
Thanks, Carlos. And yeah, so don't get me started on the whole internet, right? The state shelled out tons of money for internet, and Jamie could talk. Jamie could attest to my testimony as far as what happened to Cheyenne. I don't know. She cut out. How much did California give us? No. So it really comes down to, regardless of the money being out there, sometimes those on the ground projects we don't see. That policy work isn't there. And so Jamie actually convinced me to be like the co-chair of the CAF policy committee. And I said, you know, at the end of the day, you could send out grants to people, and you want to know why there's not BIPOC communities that are applying for these grants, is because you aren't allowing people in your guidelines to apply for these funds. You're not saying, okay, these are specialty crops. And in that specialty crops, you don't list certain foods. We're like, oh, we can't apply for that because we can't pick pine nuts. Pine nuts aren't on there. Or, oh, we're not going to pick our traditional resources because, you know, that's not on there. So at the end of the day, you know, I agree with Carlos's statement. We all have different communities and different needs. And when you leave a NOFA, or, you know, whether it be a federal grant or a state grant that you're applying for, at the end of the day, if some of those allowable activities are not written on there, I hate to say it, but most people will think, oh, that's not applicable to me. I can't apply this to my garden because it's not a specialty crop. Or, oh, I'm not doing this because I don't have the necessary water infrastructure that NRCS needs in order to, say, upgrade my water systems for water efficiency things. And so it's really not user friendly if you're not in that scientific community that go, oh, I'm already doing that. So how do I write that? How do I build capacity within the systems that currently exist and leverage the necessary resources without receiving technical assistance in order to leverage some of that fund, leverage some of those funds. So at the end of the day, what triggered me was there's money out there, but sometimes we need people to advocate for different needs. And when I say we need people to advocate, you're seeing nothing but majority of how would I say this, Caucasian or well-known businesses and nonprofit organizations that have years applying for funds, but you have no BIPOC community-driven organizations, there's a reason why they're not applying. And their reason is probably a very valid reason, because the language isn't friendly. And so at the end of the day, I know tribal communities are definitely affected by policy. And when the resources aren't provided to tribal communities, it's a lot harder to build that capacity and break down and dismantle some of the systems about food access and food health disparities. And sometimes that requires someone to speak up and say, hey, where's your tribal liaison? Hey, where is the person that's going to do some PR throughout the communities of California for the different tribes? Did you also consider the tribes that don't have federal recognition, that aren't under your guidelines, that don't have a land base? How are they able to access some of those funds in order to go and gather some of their traditional resources and so forth? So I think Carlos is very valid in describing that even Indigenous people today, we don't consider some of our practices agriculture practices. They're cultural practices that we do on a seasonal basis that might not be on our land. And so it's always good to learn about how other people manage their resources. But at the same time, we have to be very cognizant of where this land is located. What does that tribal partnership look like? Are consultations being done in a meaningful manner? Because at the end of the day, if I'm spending X amount of hours doing tribal consultation, is that going to yield any financial resources with those policymakers that are saying, hey, what are the budget appropriations? Is that enough to carry out, for X amount of tribes throughout California? We're doing a whole thing for California land back, but we have to be very cognizant that only 3% of the land in California belongs to Native American tribes, whereas historically, a good majority of that land was not restricted and was maintained by tribes. What does that relationship look like? And it really just varies depending on policy, right? Policy that says whether you work with county officials, policy, whether you have advocates at the state level, or even finding those allies within organizations such as CAF that say, okay, we have a long history of doing X, Y, and Z. How can we help open up doors for other people? So my policy work really was just Jamie reaching out and saying, hey, Cheyenne, you have some good points. And I said, at the end of the day, if there's no funding for some of our tribes or BIPOC communities, we can't change the systems or accessibility to food without having funding, because that equity, that capacity building lies in the appropriations given out during budget time.
Thanks, Diane.
Yeah.
Getting some love from Timo here in the chat. Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, so a question I would ask myself is, I'm a formerly trained administrator and finance person. Like, why, first of all, why the hell am I here, and what relevance does it have? And I think what I've realized this past couple of years is, when you have policy and government in general, the function of government is one half, here are the laws, here's what you can and cannot do. Other half, this is where the money goes. So that is really as simple as government. That's what government is. And I realized if you are at the table talking about where the money goes, you literally, and you're also paying you're paying taxes, and you're not at the table, you're being exploited. And if you're not building infrastructure and organizations that get access to those tables, you're literally paying into a system that's exploiting you. So what I've realized is, like, that half of the other half of government about allocations, resources, is budget land. And that's what I do for a living. I create budgets and financial systems for organizations, specifically nonprofits. So I realize I have perfectly trained to confront this side of the aisle, and that's what I've done. So what I ultimately, what I became, or I've gotten involved, because I realized you can't you can't change your condition unless you go out there and do something about it and get access to resources to pay people and establish systems to better the condition of a people. So that is why I've been involved in this policy space. And if you take it another step back at the macro level, is the basis of power is land. This is why the colonists came over and literally murdered the indigenous people to get access to land, to build their kingdom, to build their empire. So you have to take all that into consideration, is that in place of colonialism, we still have that in the mind, but now it's just corporate interests that function in the same capacity and ultimately do the same thing more subtly and more bureaucratically. So that being said, you have to engage in this space very tactically, and with a plan and with organization to do that. And it just happens that my thinking, I'm a systems builder, and my mindset is just very much aligns with what's going on this side of the aisle. So that's why I'm here, because ultimately it's my objective to get my people, specifically Black Americans, back in tune with the land, so we can actually have the foundation to better ourselves and better our communities. And then after that, aligning with other indigenous, other people of color to actually truly change the power dynamics in this country, in the state. We're talking state right now, but then ultimately taking this movement and going national and being like, okay, what does this land back look like? What is reparations? What does it actually look like? How is it actually going to happen? So, and then that's where people like me and Jamie become, it's like, okay, it's one thing to be emotional, get mad and have pitchforks, another thing to actually have an established plan of action for how you are going to engage the powers that be and the people who need resources to actually bridge them to the other side of actually having autonomy and power. And it just always comes back to, oh, you don't have any land. You can't do anything because you actually can't build systems. You can't build factories. You can't provide for yourself. So you're dependent on the same people that exploited you. So that's why I'm here. And ultimately, with our policy efforts, having been in my background, I'm corporate. I studied accounting and finance. My first job out of college with Ernst & Young. So literally the most corporate thing on the planet, Big Four accounting. So I understand I understand corporate. Corporate doesn't care about your feelings. Corporate cares about getting more and more and more. And the momentum of that is not going to change unless there's a formidable force of organization that's there to be like, actually, no, we're not going to do this anymore. This is how we're going to do that. So what I really want to see happen is, taking this task force and aligning with other similar movements to where there's a basis of operations, administration, and bureaucracy to where big ag, corporate interests, rich landowners actually have to be like, okay, wow, now we have to do something because the tide's against us. Because that's the only way things are going to change, is if you force their hand. So that's where my skill set, that's where my thinking, and that's why I'm here. So that's all I got for that.
Thanks, y'all. The solid points all around. I'm very I'm very impressed with just some of the responses, and we lost Carlos again. Hopefully he'll jump back here. But yeah, really appreciate those perspectives. And I mean, gosh, yeah, Adam, you've seen like the belly of the beast, right? And I guess this leads to my next question, which is kind of this blending of building power, but also looking at our landscape right now, from my vantage point, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, and this is a bad take, but land access has been the #1 issue for forever among communities of color and small scale farmers, underserved farmers, farm workers, countless times, countless reports, Farmer Equity Act, National Young Farmers Coalition, CAPS Farmer Survey, all of these things say land access #1 issue. Why does it feel as if nothing has happened until now, until these last few years? And we're seeing this movement and this power building that seems to be coming up. And I'm curious if that's something that y'all have seen too. And why do you think that is? I've got some theories and I associate it with political movements. But I'm curious what y'all's take is. That This has just been such a massive issue, but we haven't really seen massive shifts. Maybe Adam, if you want to go first.
I was just thinking about why the events in my life that really led to being over here in this space, caring about land access. And it was multifaceted, but I'll be very blunt. It was Trump getting elected that really like shook my reality, and actually I had to confront a lot of things in my life and be like, okay, well, that happened. That's out of my control. But what am I actually going to do? So that really just made me want to be more self-reliant, self-sufficient, and actually think about the reality itself, which starts with agriculture, but starts with land. So I think with me personally, that was like the catalyst for why I ended up over here. And I think I could say that speaking for people in general, like especially Black Americans, is like that was a shock to a lot of us. And then I think in general, we're having a more it feels like a health renaissance where veganism and people actually caring about food, caring about where food comes from. So I think there's a lot of, in addition to just very egregious, like, call it what you want, climate change, there's something's going on. So we had better do something about it. So I think these are the factors that are really getting people to actually look at the foundation. It's like, okay, well, we got to do something different. We have to divest from these systems that are destroying the planet. What do we need to do? Oh, okay. Well, let's start with growing our own food. Oh, okay. So I think there has been a lot of things culturally that have happened, political shifts, and then cultural changes in regard to just health, individual health, and then food in general that has led to our policy wins. And then just the tide shifting there where people are actually being like, oh, let's talk about land. Let's actually talk about land. Oh, let's actually look about what happened in this country and why land is consolidated in the powers that be. So I think that's my perception of reality.
Cheyenne or Carlos, any thoughts on that question? I don't know if Carlos, you caught it. Let me know if you completely missed it.
So
I did. No, I heard it. Go ahead, Shan.
So just to kind of piggyback on what Adam said, at the end of the day, I think it really has to do with our political presence. And regardless of your Republican or conservative, Republican or Democratic or whatever party you associate with, at the end of the day, we're all affected by the food prices. At the end of the day, we have to be very cognizant. Are we living within our means? Are we overindulging? And when I say, there's basic necessities such as the house, the food, the clothing, and then there's just excess. When you really look at the people that have excess land or are above the just basic survival mode, those people, I guess, don't rely within the systems and have accessibility issues. Those are the people that have generational wealth that's built on like genocide. At the end of the day, the people who are sitting in the political spots, they don't necessarily know what it's like to have to drive 4 hours to find a mall. They're the people you want to invite to your community, because in a harsh reality, if there was another pandemic similar to COVID, you could really see the communities that were without. The shelves are empty, especially in our rural communities when COVID hit and everything went down. Not only did we lack medicine, but we lacked food. And it was kind of one of those basic necessities of how come I am not getting meat? How come I can't get hamburger? But I see cows in my field and I have a corporate person who owns that X amount of cows ahead, but I can't get meat to my local market. And there's literally a huge ranch outside my house. Where's the local butcher? Where's my local, one of the local, how would you say, farming areas has an orchard and they grow their own eggs. It was kind of one of those, just finding the homegrown people in order to access some of these fruits and vegetables. So at the end of the day, I think our political environment factors into a lot of these land back things. It's having someone continuously like advocate, hey, whose land are you on? Oh, how do you open up opportunities for COVID funding or COVID relief? Well, the words that you use sometimes spark someone else's interest. Like, oh, I could be called a land steward and in stuff I'm doing already, I could receive resources because of COVID. Okay, this is great. It's because somebody thought of people beyond just that regular farmer who needed additional income. The farmer market people that said, hey, we're not able to have our farmers markets because of X, Y, and Z. And to leverage some of those resources that were sent out during COVID really allowed some of our rural areas and tribal communities to sustain that whole bartering food program system to help ensure everybody was getting access to food when there was little to nothing coming into our grocery stores.
Yeah, and just like overly emphasizing, right, those like infrastructural components that are so deeply connected to this land access conversation. Carlos, any thoughts? Anything to add?
Yeah. I think I mean I echo what Cheyenne and Adam have said. It's really like, it always makes me think about there's this philosopher Michel Foucault, French if I'm not mistaken, that he's one of his quotes gets a lot of play, but it's misunderstood a lot of the times, which is knowledge is power, right? So the way that we understand is if you have the knowledge, you have the power. But the way that I've always understood that quote in the context here is that first of all, you have to understand that power isn't a thing, it's a verb, it's a relationship. So when you think about power as a relationship, and then you have knowledge is power, basically what you're saying is that there are specific things that once you know them will change your relationship with anything and everything around you. So if we take that into consideration, we look at who are the experts in the land that are working the land in our regions, we really begin to see a different relationship. And in that relationship, we really begin to see a different set of power. The way that we look at that in relation to what we're discussing here as far as equity and land and these issues that we have has to do with who has land and what is the relationship that they have with that land and how that's related to an economic system that we have. So if you look at the demographics that you presented when we first started off the conversation, that land is owned and held by a very few group of people. And if that is the thing that we're understanding with knowledge is power, then you really begin to see that the ownership and the tenure of this land creates a very distinct power dynamic that does something very specifically to the regions, because the land is then being used as a tool in this specific mechanism. So when you really take that, you really start looking at a lot of exploitations with the land. You really begin to look at a lot of impoverished communities with that land. You really begin to look at a lot of diseases that happened in the maintenance and management of that land. For example, here for us, we know that growing at an industrial level produces chemicals in the air, chemicals in the water, chemicals in the ground. So the relationship that you have with that particular land, the power that you have with that land gives you also political power, because the economic weight that that land has changes policies and changes politicians as well. And I'll name that, quite frankly and quite honestly, it's big here in the Central Valley. And that's the thing that we have to look at, is it's like, how is the ownership of land and the relationship that we have with that land as power changing the power dynamics for decision makers that are going to be representative of the populations on which they work and function and work for. And if that doesn't equate, then that's the distortion that is needed to really be analyzed, to really understand how we can change a power system that's going to allow people individually to have voices for their communities, to be representative so that action can actually happen. Because that's the bureaucracy that we're experiencing here with the power structure. The power structure that we have here through the land ownership that we have in the Central Valley is creating the barriers that do not allow progress. For example, the tenure issues that we are having doesn't allow those to move forward. So if we begin to see the numbers change in the ownership of the land and the tenure of the land, you're gonna see a power distortion and a power change that a lot of the times overall folks are kind of concerned about. And that's part of the reason why I specifically don't see that much is happening, is because that's what's going to happen. Is it's going to be a distortion of power, and with that, it's going to distort politics and policy. So
Yep.
how do we, I mean, how do we, and that ultimately is going to affect like our issues with land tenure ownership to have production of food, right? So we have alternative food production models that we're exploring that won't be able to function because of that power structure. You change that power structure, those regional food systems are going to start to be built. And it's just barely now that people are beginning to understand that the experts in the community know the policies, know the politics, know their politicians, and know how to work within those communities, that you really begin to see that change because those voices are beginning to just now be heard.
Yeah. Oh boy, I gotta like sit with that sometimes. But yeah, I think that's a really solid component to all of this, Carlos. And I taking it back to politics, and this is my answer to my own question is like I kind of associate with Adam's answer of like Trump getting elected, honestly, like movements around Bernie Sanders and like that kind of activism and shift changed the way that a lot of people think about these systems, and honestly changed the way that a lot of people, and curious what other folks that think, like, please, put your feedback to this question in the chat. Feel free of like, I think that society is kind of waking up a little bit to like corporate power of our systems and of our lives in a really real way, and particularly in the ag and food and agriculture space, we're seeing that when it comes to land. And a lot of farmers I work with, like, we're literally seeing Harvard Endowment buy 30,000 acres as their neighbor, and they're like, this isn't okay. Man, it's disrupting people, your lives. So appreciate our panelists. We're gonna use the last, I guess, 20 minutes we have here to actually ask you all some questions. And so kind of I've got 2 poll questions, and then like just general, like drop it in the chat, or we can raise your hand and I can unmute you if you've got feedback. But this one poll question is like actually about our collective that organizes, that many of us are a part of, like are currently grappling with, like, yes, we're advocating and we're like kind of watchdogging and engaging with this land equity task force, and we will for a long time. But what are some other things that feel urgent in terms of actually like land related advocacy? And so I listed a few things that are definitely of top of mind in terms of like land related advocacy that's needed. And so I'd be curious what folks here think. So I'm going to launch this poll. Hopefully you could see it. And the question is like, what do you see as one of the most pressing policy solutions on land that must be worked on in the immediate future? There's questions about just government grants to buy land for beginning and BIPOC farmers. There's questions about like, one of the answers is, restrictions on corporate consolidation, tax benefits. Like, curious, use like a 30 seconds or the next few minutes here to answer this poll question, because I think it's really valuable to see what folks in this group think. In the meantime, as folks are completing that poll, I'm going to drop in the chat some more information. This is like a public link to which is a public announcement for the California Agricultural Land Equity Task Force. It kind of just talks about, recently they opened applications for the task force itself, but gives some context as to like what is the task force, and and we can all kind of drop our contact information at the end here. And if you have specific questions about the task force itself, we'd be happy to answer these things. So yeah, keep on answering this poll. Maybe I'll leave it open for like 1 more minute. But yeah, I'm seeing high percentages of, oh yeah, community-owned models. That's what's up. We didn't even get into that. Okay, 20 more seconds, and then I'm gonna end the poll. Complete it, please. You're out there. Okay. It's seeming like a tie, which makes life a little bit difficult when we're trying to narrow it down on what can we do or what should we focus on in this next like year. So I'm gonna end this poll, but it is really helpful to see, like, I mean, not a huge majority, but a lot of people are looking at restrictions on corporate consolidation and private investment, large numbers in terms of development for more community land trusts for urban and rural farmers. I think we can do something around community-owned land models as it relates to land trust. Maybe that'll tackle both of those things. Nobody is interested in tax benefits for land transition or succession. So that's fascinating. But this is really helpful. Just getting a sense of where people are at. So our next question here, just to see, so I guess a little bit context before I drop this poll question is, this land equity task force that we've talked about, a little bit here and there throughout this session, this is a state level effort. I find personally that engaging in state advocacy is like super, super impactful in a state like California. No shade to like smaller states like Vermont, but it looks different. We live in the 5th largest economy in the world. So impacting state level advocacy is kind of important, but curious because there's a lot of folks here that engage on federal things and probably local and regional. So this next question is, in your opinion, at what level of government should like immediate policy solutions kind of occur? National / federal, state, local, or regional? And I did kind of do a pitch for state, so I may have skewed the results here. And yeah, while we have this poll going, I'm seeing some energy. Oh, I thought I showed the results. I'm sorry. Oof, uh-oh. This is beyond my Zoom capacity. I can try to show the results after, but I see a question here. I'll answer it. Yeah, so maybe take like one more minute to complete this poll. Okay. Okay, it's looking like a lot of regional, a lot of state. Okay, let's see if I can actually, oh, share results. Okay, you should all be able to see this last poll question. So yeah, most folks are more interested in engaging on state and regional policy, which that's good. That's really interesting and useful to know. And like the reality is that I think those are really meaningful places. I think regional acknowledge is like can be complex in terms of like what you consider a region. But yeah, just kind of getting a sense that you know, most folks here are interested, if not already engaging on either state or regional or a little bit of federal. So yeah, I think thank you for answering those poll questions. I think it's valuable for all of us to kind of see what's most important to people that kind of engage on land access related issues and are really interested in land access related issues. It just to our panelists, are you guys surprised by any of those responses, or like any thoughts on how those responses kind of came in? And feel free, if folks want to chime in about it, feel free to raise your hand.
I think my perspective and my lived experience is very much state level, so I'm very much biased, but it seems to me like state is the perfect balance of resources and power and responsiveness, whereas like local may be responsive, but they may not actually have the capital to bring into reality real agricultural initiatives, whereas the state, especially the state of California, has billions upon billions of dollars to dole out. So I think the state, probably, yeah, no, I'm riding with the state for that reason, the balance of power and responsiveness. You're muted, Jamie.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I was gonna say, if anybody else has perspectives on these poll results, feel free to chime in. These next like 10 minutes or so are very much open forum, and like definitely curious what others on this call think, or questions that you all might have in terms of the ways in which we've engaged when it comes to the task force, but also other things. I've seen a couple, but
So,
yeah, go ahead,
and
Cheyenne.
Jamie, mine, you know, as I work for a county government, it's one of those, at the end of the day, I think the state has the resources, and it kind of serves as a model for the rest of everybody else throughout California. So, I think the state is a very good example of opportunities that allow everybody else to hop on board to do things. So a great example is like the Strategic Growth Council, right? They have these priorities, and these priorities align from housing to land back and food initiatives. And it's kind of one of those opportunities that if certain people are in positions to help advocate for the needs of both urban and rural communities, great, because there's a space that allow for that dialogue to occur at a state level, and then it filters down. You know, it's always great to give out mini grants to people, but if you want to make like a systematic change, you really have to get the policymakers at the state level involved in order to see that change occur.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the questions that was asked, are there any groups or resources to keep up with regarding these issues? By Justina, and I can speak for what I know, and curious what others. When it comes to state related issues, I'll just make a pitch for myself and for CAF. We do a lot of we do a lot of state level advocacy as it relates to land, and there aren't enough of us like organizers and advocates when it comes to land access issues, but it's growing. I know that we've got American Farmland Trust on the call too. And so that's kind of my sense on the state level. Of course, when it comes to federal issues, as it relates to land access, I think National Young Farmers Coalition is probably doing the most in terms of bringing attention to this issue. But there are other organizations that definitely engage in land access as it relates to like federal advocacy, like National Sustainable Ag Coalition, among others. I think when it comes to local stuff, it's totally up to where you're based. Did I miss anything, y'all? Other panelists? Okay, take that as a no. Covered it. And yeah, do others have questions? I've got more questions for this group. I would love to ask them, but also want to use this opportunity to let others kind of chime in on like, yeah, what are you doing when it comes to land access issues, or yeah, what questions do you have when it comes to land access advocacy and those kinds of things?
Hi, I don't have resources per se, but I was going to invite
Yeah,
anyone in this group, and I'm here with my cousin Adam. Hi, Adam. He invited me. This is awesome.
yes.
I wanted to have you guys, if anybody's available. So I'm part of the teachers union, and we have this new group called the Educators Climate Advocacy Network, and it's going to be, it's about sustainability, and it's a national network with both AFT and NEA. So we have guest speakers, and I would love for you guys to come and speak, because there's people doing all kinds of different things all over the country. And I think they need to hear about what you guys are doing. It'd be great.
So thanks for sharing the invite. I mean, teachers are essential. They spend so much time with their kids. And at the end of the day, I mean, I think we lack in our school curriculum the basic necessities to survive. And so growing is a great teaching skill.
And then number two, really quick, we're doing curriculum. So we're building different types of curriculum. And currently with the, I don't know if you guys know about the curriculum that does exist, mostly in the Central Valley, like in Bakersfield area. Most of the people that are doing the career and technical work are agribusiness. So we need some other options for teachers instead of the agribusiness curriculum that exists. Yeah.
Endorse. Strongly endorse. I hear you. I've heard that before, and it's terrifying. Or like it goes both ways, right? Like, Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't imagine that agriculture is considered a career in the LA Unified School District. And I've heard this in other urban spaces of like, they don't encourage. Yeah. Strong no. Yeah. Other folks want to jump in? Have any questions, or yeah, thank you for sharing that, Rory. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, hi. Hello. Yeah, thank you so much. Lots of good information. I was just really curious if any folks are trying to leverage the land repurposing under the Sigma Groundwater Act from the fallowing. I know that they're trying to move away from intensive ag uses, but to the extent that we can use our native and traditional foods. I'm also indigenous as well, and that may be an opportunity for native plants and some foods or fibers kinds of work. And then also, through 30 by 30, like trying to leverage some of those land conservation payouts. I'm just curious if anybody's also looking at that as an opportunity, to the extent that they exist, of partnering with land trusts to get land back in that form. Thank you, guys.
Carlos, are you still out there? I feel like you would be very equipped to answer this.
Yeah, I'm still here. I from my understanding, one of the ways to look at it is specifically with land trust is the necessity for land. It's basically the idea of land changing hands. So for a lot of the land trust, a lot of the times to become like food systems ready, like that's part of the access that we're looking at, right? That is the barrier. is that folks don't have land. So for a way to collectively own land, for a way to collectively, and perhaps even in perpetuity, to own land, for that transfer to happen, like that's a really difficult thing that like no one is doing, right? And that is the barrier. So for me to look at it from that perspective is for land trust to really begin to explore that. This is to really begin to work with folks where land is given back. And I know that that's a very profound sentence, right? Just give land back. It's simple, but it's like so complex, right? Because that is the barrier. The complexity of it is the barrier, but that is really what needs to happen. So for people to have sovereignty and for people to have autonomy, right? That land has to be there first. And as land trusts that are formed, like that's almost like a curse word, it's just like, that's almost like we can't consider that. But it's just like, okay, maybe you should consider that once and try it out and be intentional in making it work. And I know that's super difficult and it's easy for me to say, right? Like I'll admit to that. But that's really, in a sense, part of what the issue is that needs to happen. And maybe working with folks that understand the management and understand the systems and are willing to develop the systems of collective ownership and thoughtful management and ancestral knowledge and tech, right? That can be applied and used. And again, and to have that relationship with that land that will intentionally make that a success. And once that becomes a success, then it's more likely that can actually begin to happen and multiply. But that has to be intentional. So for us and for me to look at it from that perspective, it's the one thing that I feel folks don't want to do, but it seems that is the thing that needs to happen. So
There's also a precedent. Oh, I apologize. I just wanted to share that there is a precedent. I just saw that there are a couple tribes through a land conservation grant down in Kern County just received land back as part of a land trust deal where they have the ownership now. And just thinking that, working with land trusts could also help attract money from people who want, or at least, or the landowner who gets a tax benefit or what have you. Just trying to look at it from creative ways, working within the system we have, and trying to make it work for us.
Great point, Heather. And I think it just varies again, depending on location. So a good example is tribes that have advocated to receive land back, depending on the county that they lived in. Some of them have had like constructive feedback, and others have said, wait, time out. What are you going to do with that? Are you going to build a casino? And some of those landowners are like anti-casino, and you're like, time out. Casinos allow for economic development to allow for tribes to do housing. And a good example is I put in a link to an initiative that is being done here locally by one of our nonprofits about buying like a 5-acre oasis. And our tribes here locally, there's about 5 tribes in Inyo and Mono counties. I've heard comments that said, time out, why is that nonprofit doing that? They shouldn't be doing that. And that's our own people saying, time out, we're not going to fund that because there's going to be ownership issues, especially if there's 3 or 4 different tribes. And it's kind of like the intent was so that they could start bringing back original stewardship to that area. And they're fundraising, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And at the same time, hearing our tribal elected officials say, well, they shouldn't be doing that is kind of one of those, depending on where you're from and access for even thinking that you should have land back put into Indigenous management. It really just depends on your location. And so Southern California tribes, they're a lot more competitive as far as putting land trust or an act through California state. Same with over by Fresno. I've watched Corso, Norfolk, not necessarily battle Chick-Chansey, but when it comes time for trying to absorb land back into Indigenous tribes, depending on the intention, it's kind of a harder concept to grasp. So I think there is a need. Again, it just depends if it's a tribal priority or your partners for wanting to put land back into trust or to utilize nonprofit organizations that allow you to receive access to X, Y, and Z in order to increase agriculture use or indigenous stewardship
Yeah.
for tribal ecological knowledge.
Yeah. Well, folks, with that, we are very much at time, but wanting to just please join me in thanking our panelists today, or this evening, I guess. Adam and Cheyenne and Carlos, for sharing their experiences so far. Thank you all for spending your Monday evening with us talking about land access, a very difficult topic. And I really hope that you all kind of learned something or gained something from participating in this space. Feel free to reach out to any of us on, or maybe I shouldn't volunteer, y'all. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to learn more about this land equity task force or some of the things that we're doing and as part of our kind of organizing collective. But yeah, I learned a lot, and I hope you all did too. So I really appreciate the time.
Hey, Jamie,
Sweet.
where's the recording going to be? It's going to be on CAP website. Do we know?
It will be, I think all of the recordings for the conference will be released after the conference, probably on YouTube or something. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
But thanks. Good night.